Hey guys, Oblivion903 here once again, and this is episode 6 of Flashback Friday. In the last video I did the first fighting game of the series. It was WCW NWO Revenge on the N64, and after doing this video I did feel quite in the mood to continue on with the fighting games. However, I did sort of worry about what I was going to choose, because if I was going to do 2 in a row, then this one really needed to be special. This had to be one of the biggest fighting games of all time. It's something truly remarkable that has truly just set the stage for the genre itself. And when I got down to thinking what I was going to choose, only one game really popped to mind, and that game is this one. This is Street Fighter 2. Released in arcades back in 1991 following the original Street Fighter game in 1987, it's often credited for starting the boom of fighting games that appeared throughout the 1990s, such as Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat and Virtua Fighter. Street Fighter 2 absolutely dominated the arcade in the year following its release, bringing in hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. This led to the eventual release on consoles, which sold around 14 million copies in total, which for the gaming industry back in the early 90s, that is absolutely phenomenal. The game centres around one-on-one combat in a best of 3 round style fight. The player can choose between 8 fighters in arcade mode, where they've got to defeat the remaining 7 before battling 4 bosses, which are known as the Grandmasters. The characters in the game range from martial arts experts to professional wrestlers to strange beasts that were raised in the jungle in Brazil. The origins of the Grandmasters in the game is a fairly interesting one, as Sagat was actually the final boss in Street Fighter 1, but the remaining 3 are all new to the series. But when the game was brought over to the West, all their names were actually changed. First up, in the Western games we have an African American boxer who goes by the name of Balrog. However, in Japan he is actually known as M. Bison. This is because M. Bison actually stands for Mike Bison, which is a parody of the great boxer Iron Mike Tyson. However, when the game was released in the West, Capcom feared a lawsuit, so they changed the name to Balrog. But in Japan, Balrog is actually the name of Vega, who is the second Grandmaster in the game. And the guy that we know in the game as M. Bison is actually called Vega in Japan. However, when the game was brought over to the West, Capcom thought that Vega didn't really sound like a threatening name, especially for a warlord, so they changed it to M. Bison. So it's actually quite confusing, really. It's actually a really confusing thing to tell you. There is pictures online that sort of show the comparisons in names, but between the West and Japan we have Balrog, who is Bison, then we've got Vega, who is Balrog, and last but not least we've got Bison, who is Vega. Confusing, I know. But anyway, back to the game itself. After the success of Street Fighter 2, Capcom went on to make a whole sub-series of these games, releasing a total of 5 games under the Street Fighter 2 name. In 1992, Capcom released the second game under the Street Fighter 2 banner. This one was the Champion Edition, which allowed players to play as the 4 Grandmasters from the original game, as well as being able to play in mirror matches, which was basically you could play against the character that you're playing as. And they also refined the balancing on the characters. Later in 1992, they released the third game, which was the Hyper Fighting Edition, which mainly just increased the speed of the gameplay and also a few new changes to moves and the inputs. I'd also like to point out that I am actually playing this video on the Hyper Fighting version of the game. It was ported to the Xbox 360 and PS3 back in the late 2000s. The following year they released Super Street Fighter 2, which once again improved the characters' balancing, as well as introducing 4 new characters to the series, which I'll be showing you a little later on. This was the first game in the series also to use a new engine, which allowed for better graphics and animation, which also followed into the final game of the series, which is called Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, which saw continued character improvements, as well as the inclusion of super combos and air combos, which has become a mainstay in the series. This game also marked the first appearance of Akuma. Now for the next part of the video, I'm going to be showing you footage from the HD remake of Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, which was released on the 360 and PS3 back in 2010. And although this is a HD remake in 1080p, you can just see that even the original was a lot better graphically than the original games were, and it also shows how the series sort of came along and progressed from the original Street Fighter to this one. As mentioned a bit earlier, there were 4 new characters introduced to the series. First up there was a guy called T-Hawk. Next up there was Cammy, who has long become a favourite in the series, and then there was Fei Long, who's a martial art expert who looks a bit like Bruce Lee, and then finally DJ, who was actually the first character to be designed by an American. The popularity of Street Fighter 2 led to numerous movies being released, including a fantastic animated movie which is well worth the watch if you get the opportunity to, as well as a live action movie starring Jean-Claude Van Damme as Guile, Kylie Minogue as Cammy, and Raul Julia as M. Bison, who sadly passed away shortly after he completed the movie. Now, while we're on the subject of other forms of media for the Street Fighter series, there is a little interesting fact. Ken was actually the first character to be given the last name, which is Masters. Ken's full name is Ken Masters. This is because Mattel were producing Street Fighter figures, and they didn't want him to be confused with Ken from the Barbie series, who they also produce. I don't understand how they would confuse him. I don't know. Maybe it would have went together. Maybe a good Hadouken would have done Barbie the World a good. But apparently they didn't want to be confused, so that is why he got a surname. It is worth noting, however, though, that some of the Street Fighter characters did have surnames prior to Ken being given his, such as E. Honda, who is actually called Edmund Honda. As you can see, Street Fighter has become a huge global success, with many of the characters being household names amongst gamers. One of the biggest gaming tournaments in the world was started originally because of Street Fighter. If you haven't heard of it before, it's called Evolution, and it attracts thousands of players each year, and hundreds of thousands of people watch it over the course of the tournament, and it's where the top players in the world go to compete against each other. Some people have made a lot of money and made careers on the back of this tournament. As I said at the start of the video, to do 2 fighting games in a row, I needed this one to be the biggest fighting game of all time, and one that just absolutely defined the genre, and I don't think that statement is a lie. Street Fighter is an absolutely fantastic series that is still thriving today. And on that note, that brings us to the conclusion of this week's episode of Flashback Friday. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope you've enjoyed the series so far. I've had an absolutely fantastic time making them, and I can't wait to get more done. If you haven't watched any of the videos so far, the links are in the description, so check those out, and I will see you guys very, very soon. Until then, bye for now.